Welcome to the third video in our series, Developing Your Harmonic Awareness to Improve Your Musicianship. Harmony drives so much of musical meaning and should guide your music making. In the last two videos, we made sure that you're comfortable with chord roots, inversions, and qualities. We also covered how to find the key of any passage, even when the key signature doesn't match the music. If you're still at all unsure about either of those topics, this is the perfect time to go back and review the practice examples at the end of those videos. This video will still be here when you're ready, and you'll get a lot more out of it if your chord analysis skills are solid. Now let's pause for a moment to acknowledge the strangeness of figured bass. To analyze your favorite non-Baroque piece, you still need a detailed understanding of a cryptic Baroque-era notation system for basso continuo performance. Today, the most common analysis notation for tonal music is Roman numerals. They begin with the scale degree of the chord's root written as a Roman numeral, followed by small Arabic numerals as a code for the chord inversion. These inversion numbers come directly from a 17th century pop chord symbol system, one that very few musicians actually use in performance anymore. A lot of music theory professors would love to retire this outdated and complicated shorthand system, but for now the reality is, the better you understand figured bass, the better you'll be at using standard analysis notation so that you can interpret, write, arrange, or critique music, and also making sense of other people's analyses of music you care about. In this video, we'll take you beyond labeling chord inversions to understanding how the whole system works so that you can confidently read even the weird figured bass numbers that pop up now and then. Figured bass will give you information about the notes in the chord, the accidentals that need to be used, and the chord's inversion. It appears in two different contexts as a way of encapsulating what is in a chord. Next to a Roman numeral, figured bass can specify the chord's inversion. This is usually how figured bass is used in modern harmonic analysis. Traditionally, however, figures were placed next to a bass note to specify the interval above the bass note for each note in the chord. We'll actually be doing both kinds of figured bass in our part writing and analysis exercises. Figures should always appear next to the Roman numerals of chords that aren't root position triads, but we'll also be using bass notes with figures, just like the Baroque musicians did, when we're learning to create beautiful chord progressions that adhere to the conventions of tonal harmony. So you'll need to know more about figured bass than just that 6 means first inversion and 6/4 means second. But the better you do know the really common figures like these, the faster you'll be. So as I just mentioned, a root position triads figure is 5/3. But since it's the default, it can be left blank. First inversion is 6/3, or usually just 6, since we only have to write figures that alter the default. And second inversion is 6/4. For 7th chords, there's a little mnemonic you can remember where you basically just count down from 7. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, or 4/2. And that gives you root, first, second, and third inversions. So these are the inversion symbols that appear next to Roman numerals. But knowing how figured bass works in general will give you access to all the rest of the weird figures that you'll see when non-chord tones and accidentals start cropping up. Here's the procedure that you can use to decipher any figured bass symbol. It all boils down to knowing that the default figure is 3, 5, 8, and that any numbers that you see are alterations to one of these default digits. The numbers will always be one away from 3, 5, or 8, and all you have to do is replace that default number with the one that's printed. So if you see a 7 and nothing else, The 7 is 1 away from 8, so you replace 8 with 7, and you use the other two default numbers, giving you 3, 5, and 7. If you see a 6 and nothing else, the 6 is 1 away from 5, so you leave the 8 and 3 as is and replace the 5 with 6, giving you 3, 6, and 8. But there's one problem with this system. The number 4 is 1 away from 5, but it's also 1 away from 3. So the only thing you have to memorize to get good at reading figured bass is what to do when there's a 4. The default case for 4s is simple. If all you see is a 4, then it always replaces 3. But if there's already a 3 written in addition to the 4, or if there's a 2 that replaces the default 3, then two things happen, and it's important to remember them both. The 4 replaces the 5 instead of 3, and the unwritten third number, which should be an 8, is now understood to be a 6. So that you can see this in action, here are some of the most commonly seen figures that feature the number 4, along with a diagram of the figured bass shorthand system. Let's make sure that each of these figures follows the weird 4 rule that we just learned about. First, the 4 by itself is replacing the default 3, since there isn't a 3 or 2 written in the figure. And the rest of the numbers will just be the defaults, so we get 4, 5, and 8. The next figure is like the first, where 4 replaces 3, since there isn't a 3 or 2 written below it. But now we have a 6 as well, which replaces the default 5. And the last number will be the default 8, like before, making 4, 6, 8. The 4 in the third example does have a 3 under it, so this follows the dashed green arrow in the diagram and replaces 5 instead of 3. This means that we also have to follow the directions in the green box and turn the default 8 into a default 6. So the 3 and 4 are given, and the missing number is a default 6, making 3, 4, 6. In the fourth example, the 2 replaces the default 3, and since the 3 slot is now filled, again the 4 now replaces 5, and the default 8 becomes an unwritten 6. So we have a complete figure of 2, 4, 6. When you just have a 4 and a 7 in your figure, the 4 replaces the 3, and the 7 replaces 8. So the missing number is the default 5, even though there wasn't a space left in the figure for the 5 slot between the 4 and the 7. It's still the missing number. And finally, sticking a 2 under the 4 makes it now replace 5 instead of 3. And the 7 replaces the other default number, which would have been a 6 because of the rule in the green box. Now we need to make sure that you can translate these numbers into the notes that they represent. I'll give you a bass note and some numbers, and you tell me what notes should be in the chord. The goal is to be able to turn a whole chord progression from figured bass into pop chord symbols. Let's see if we can interpret this slightly unusual figured bass and give its correct pop chord symbol. The bass note is C sharp, and it has the figures 3, 5, and 8. These are just the default numbers written out instead of left blank. So a third above the bass note C sharp is E. A fifth above C sharp is G sharp. Notice that we must follow the key signature here. And an octave above C sharp is another C sharp. This is a C sharp E G sharp chord with C sharp as its root. Analyzing the quality of this triad gives a minor third and a perfect fifth above the chord's root, so its pop chord symbol is C sharp minor. Now try this one yourself. Pause and come up with this chord's pop chord symbol. From the bass note B flat, we first look for a 2 or a 4 that might replace the default 3. Finding none, we add the third above B flat, which would be a D flat. Next, we do see a replacement for the default 5, which is a 6 with a flat in front of it. So we find the note a sixth above B flat, which would be a G, and we lower it a half step without changing its letter name to G flat. Finally, the understood 8 adds another B flat to the chord. The chord is G flat, B flat, D flat, which means it's not in root position. The intervals above the root are a major third and a perfect fifth, so this is a G flat major chord over B flat. As we just saw, accidentals can appear in figured bass to raise or lower the note at that interval above the bass note by a half step. While accidentals must be to the left of notes on the staff, they can appear either before or after the figured bass numbers they're attached to. Here's another example involving accidentals. Give it a try now before I reveal the solution. The bass note A should have a raised third above it, so C becomes C sharp, and also a raised fifth, which takes the E flat of the key signature and makes it E natural. So sharps and flats in figured bass are not always literally sharps or flats in the music, because figured bass is expressed relative to the key signature. That way the same figures would apply if the music were transposed to a different key. The top number of the figured bass here is a 7. So we also need to add a G to the chord. And the result, once we determine the quality of the triad as major and the quality of the seventh as minor, is an A dominant seventh chord. Just so you know, modern figured bass does use natural symbols though. And the naturals do mean to cancel any sharps or flats in the key signature. So the natural sign in this example lowers the third above the bass from F sharp to F natural, and we end up with a D minor chord. You also need to know that other symbols are often used for accidentals, like the plus sign in this example. See if you can get the pop chord symbol for this one. A second above D is E, which means that the 4 here replaces the 5 instead of 3. So the plus symbol is the same as a sharp, which makes it G sharp. And the default top number in this figure is not an 8, but a 6 because of the 4 replacing 5 below it. This is a third inversion 7th chord, and with the intervals measured from the root E, the end result is an E dominant 7th over D. Plus signs are sometimes connected to the number itself, like you see here, instead of appearing either before or after the number. And a backward slash through any number is also the same thing as a sharp. See if you can get the pop chord symbol for this example. In this case, we have the bass note G, third above B flat, and 4 replaces 5 here to give a C. The 6 here is the default, but it is included so that it can be altered with a slash, raising the note from E flat to E natural. Since the bass note G is not the root, the chord is in second inversion, and the pop chord symbol is C7 over G. Here's an example of an extremely common figured bass symbol that you might not know how to interpret at first. Which number does the sharp apply to? Well, what is the first number that you add if you don't see anything specified in the figures to alter it? The 3. So in this case, the third above F, A flat, is raised to A natural, and this is just an F major triad. In cases where one bass note has 2 or more sets of numbers before the next bass note, this means that the upper voices move faster than the bass to change the chord, but the bass note stays the same throughout. See if you can get both pop chord symbols for this example. Here, the fourth above the bass does replace the third, so we add an understood 5, even though there isn't room for it in between the 4 and the 8 the way the figure is written. And the chord becomes E, A, B, and E, which is an E sus chord. And the changes above the bass mean that now there's a G sharp instead of the A, and a D instead of the octave E, making an E7 chord. This is one reason why a 3-5-8 figure might not be left entirely blank, because otherwise you wouldn't know to change to or from the default intervals above the bass. One last thing to remember is that the same figured bass numbers work both for telling you what chords to write and for standing next to a Roman numeral to indicate a chord's inversion. If the figure is printed for you already, like in this example, you don't have to write the inversion symbols next to the Roman numerals because they're already there. Here's a diagram that wraps around so that the figured bass number 8, which has the same note name as the bass note, is in the same place on the ring as the bass. Remember that figured bass is not given relative to the root, so only in root position do the numbers match the names of the parts of the chord, like 3rd, 5th, or 7th. So in a first inversion chord, where the bass is the chordal 3rd, the figured bass symbol is 6 and an understood 3. And the 6 is the root and the 3 is the 5th. This is always true in first inversion, even with a 7th chord, where the 5 in the figured bass is the 7th. If you can try to think of figured bass this way, using your knowledge of what part of the chord is in the bottom voice for each inversion, it will really help you in the long run. Here's a useful visual and kinesthetic way of remembering the figured bass symbols for each of the triad and 7th chord inversions. In all of these hand signs, your pinky represents the bass note. For the triads, your extended thumb represents the understood number 8 on top of all of the figures, and you retract each finger in turn to show where the gap is in the every other number pattern of thirds, starting with the index finger for the gap between 5 and 8 in root position, then the middle finger for the gap between 3 and 6 in first inversion, and finally the gap between the bass note and 4 in second inversion. For the 7th chords, however, none have an understood 8, so you pull your thumb in. In a root position 7th, all intervals above the bass are equidistant, so your fingers should all be apart. But then for each inversion, you indicate where the two numbers that are one apart happen by bringing two fingers together. If you have trouble physically doing this, just use your other hand to pull the two fingers together. First inversion brings your index finger from the 7 position down to the 6 position right next to the 5 represented by your middle finger. Second inversion brings your middle finger from 5 down to 4 next to the 3 represented by your ring finger. And third inversion moves your ring finger from 3 down to 2 to rub up against the bass note represented by your pinky. If you practice cycling through these hand signs every day, saying the inversion name and figure numbers that go with each, you'll end up with a great way of permanently remembering your inversion symbols. As always, I'm giving you a link to a worksheet where you can practice this with the cheat sheet materials and directions written right there on the worksheet. In the next video, we're finally getting to the good stuff, where the analysis symbols that you'll be adding actually tell you something about why the particular chords were chosen to go in that particular order so that it makes sense to listen to. Harmonic function is a really useful type of harmonic analysis, and we'll be learning the basics in the next video, and then working on refining our understanding of harmonic function and phrase structure for the rest of our study of tonal harmony. So join me in the next video to learn about functional bass analysis.